All right, y'all. Very last concept. This is concept 3 notes of Unit 7 reproduction. And we're going to be talking about pregnancy from the point of fertilization all the way through development and end with childbirth. So, just an overview, the gestation period is the time considered to be from the last menstrual period to the birth of the baby. So it's approximately 280 days. So when fertilization actually occurs, which remember is after the oocyte is, or the oocyte has been ovulated, and then the sperm gets to it, that would cause fertilization. The mother's officially 2 weeks pregnant at that point because ovulation is 2 weeks from the start of usually about 2 weeks from the start of the new menstrual cycle or the new uterine cycle. So that's kind of interesting. And then most people find out they're pregnant about 2 weeks after that when their new period should have come for the new month. And so usually people find out they're pregnant around 4 to 5 weeks pregnant. That gestation period gets broken down into some smaller pieces. The embryonic period is from fertilization to about week 8, and then the fetal period is considered to be week 9 to birth. So during that embryonic period, you refer to the baby as an embryo. During the fetal period, it's referred to as a fetus, and then once birth has happened, it can then be called officially an infant. And then the act of childbirth is known as parturition. And all of this is dictated by hormone changes. So I love this little graph. We'll look at it again in a bit, but it shows E is for estrogen and P is for progesterone. And then HCG stands for the human chorionic gonadotropin, which is just a hormone that acts like LH, the luteinizing hormone, but it isn't secreted as part of that HPG axis like we learned about in concept 1. Instead, it's actually secreted by that corpus luteum, which if implantation happens and which leads to pregnancy, then that corpus luteum doesn't degenerate like we've seen in previous concepts. So that's kind of interesting. So if you look at this, sorry, also I'm really out of breath because I am 39 weeks pregnant myself as I record this video. So if we look at this, you can see kind of when that HCG peaks is around 2 months since the start of the last menstrual period. That's what LMP stands for. So HCG is actually what gets picked up on a pregnancy test, and it grows exponentially at first, those first few weeks. And so let's say at like 4 weeks pregnant or 4 weeks since your last menstrual period, you take a pregnancy test. If it's positive, you'd see 2 lines. If you wait another 2 weeks until you're technically 6 weeks pregnant, then it should be even darker because that HCG gets stronger and stronger. And then it starts to decrease around 2 to 3 months as estrogen and progesterone pick up, and then those get really, really high towards the end of the gestation period. So in class, we're going to be doing a project about pregnancy, and we're going to go into each month and the development of the embryo/fetus, and then also changes in the mother as well. And we're going to talk about complications in pregnancy that can arise, especially in a timely manner at each month. So I am going to go through some of it in class now, but I'm just going to be hitting some highlights. The majority of it's going to be covered by this project. But I do really want to talk about this embryonic period and this stage from like fertilization to week 8, because that's the one I find to be the most fascinating and the most complex biologically speaking. So division, that's the first thing. We're basically gonna have a lot of division and then a lot of differentiation and development. That's kind of the 3 Ds we're gonna go through. So once that sperm fertilizes the egg, remember now we refer to it as the zygote. That's happened usually in the fallopian tube. Then that zygote is going to travel down the fallopian tube towards the uterus, where it's going to hopefully implant in that thick endometrium. Remember, if that implantation doesn't happen, that endometrium gets shed. That shedding is what menstruation is during the female period. So if this happens, though, then that doesn't happen. And that's why you don't have a period if you're pregnant. And that's usually one of the first signs of pregnancy. So while the zygote is making this journey to the uterus, this period called cleavage is happening, and it's rapid mitosis. So mitosis is happening a lot and it's dividing, but the cell's actually not getting bigger. So notice in this picture, like the overall, it's the same size, even though like we're getting multiple cells in here. And that's important. And what it's making is this thing called a blastocyst, which is about 4 days after fertilization, we would refer to it as a blastocyst. So because it's not actually growing larger in size, it gives it all these tiny small cells all clumped together have a really high surface area to volume ratio. Now, why would that be helpful? Well, think. This makes it so you can have much more efficient and enhanced nutrient and oxygen uptake in those cells, but also waste disposal too. So it's really helping because the rate that the zygote is developing into an embryo right now is like insane. There's a video clip I'll show you if you're my student in class that talks about this and how big, if this rate was kept up all throughout the 9 months of pregnancy, how giant babies would be. But things slow down. So this initial rate is crazy how much is going down in just the first 4 days. So again, it's all happening while it's making this journey towards the uterus. So once it's about a clump of 16 or more cells, about 72 hours after fertilization, we refer to that zygote now as a morula. And again, these are all identical cells at this point because they're just doing mitosis and doubling themselves. And then we get to that point of calling it a blastocyst when it kind of starts to have a little bit of this differentiation, which we'll be talking about in the next few slides. So the blastocyst is about 4 days after fertilization. It's a fluid-filled sphere, and it has a single layer of trophoblast cells. Okay, so that's what we see here. You can see that single layer. Those are going to eventually become the placenta, which is an endocrine organ we talked about in Unit 3, Control and Coordination, when we covered the endocrine system. That is a temporary organ, which is kind of crazy. You only have it during pregnancy. But we'll come back to that. So this thin layer is going to develop into the placenta, and then this cluster of cells is known as the embryoblast, and then this will eventually become the embryo. All right, differentiation. So that division all goes down. Then we start really getting into the differentiation. So I love this picture because you can kind of see the journey that's happening. Remember, the one dominant follicle that releases the oocyte. It releases a secondary oocyte during ovulation. Hopefully that oocyte would get fertilized by sperm. We now have our zygote, and it's making its way through the fallopian tube. Then we have that cleavage, that rapid cell division that's happening as it's traveling. Around 72 hours, we're the morula, and then we become the blastocyst, and then around 6 or 7 days, hopefully that blastocyst will implant into that endometrium in the uterus, and implantation has occurred. So this is when the blastocyst embeds itself in the endometrium of the uterine wall, and it's about a 5-day process. So about 12 days after fertilization, it would be complete. Remember, this would be around 26-ish days in a woman's cycle because, fertilization is going to occur around ovulation, which is around day 14. So this would be towards the end of the cycle when this process would kind of be over. Again, remember, if this doesn't happen, this implantation, this endometrium, that thick lining is just going to degenerate, and it's going to start a new uterine cycle and a new period of menstruation. Once it's embedded here, it's going to be nourished by some cells in the endometrium for a period of time. But prior to that, as it's traveling, there's all these secretions going down in the uterine cavity that are, as it's floating through, that are helping to nourish it. And the blastocyst is able to implant basically it gets in there by eroding the wall of the endometrium so that it can just kind of burrow in. And then the endometrial cells around it just start to proliferate, and they just basically cover it up. And that's how it implants into the uterine cavity. But what's really important to note is, y'all, implantation fails much more often than not. It's estimated. So first off, just fertilization in general isn't happening every month, okay? That's not necessarily even going to necessarily go down. But once it's fertilized, implantation is estimated that 2/3 of all these zygotes that get fertilized don't even implant. And of the third that are able to implant into the endometrium, about 30% of those are later going to miscarry. And that could be due to a genetic defect in the embryo. Remember, we saw in concept 2 that the eggs that are made from oogenesis, like there's like a 20%, failed chromosome rate, like error rate, which is very high. But it could also be due to some sort of malfunction in the uterus or just another problem. And so we talked about some of those related to infertility and reproductive technologies and concept to research and report activity. So hopefully you remember some of those. But this is not just like this is a miracle thing almost that it works every time, just because the odds are not necessarily in its favor. The reason the endometrium does accept the blastocyst, though, is because all the really high levels of estrogen and progesterone during this time. Hopefully you remember that from that inquiry activity we did about the female cycle back in concept 1, but that's what's making this really susceptible to that. One of the issues that infertile women can struggle with is having low progesterone, which will really affect this implantation. But usually that can be an easy fix. I know for me, when I found out I was pregnant, they had me come in and they did blood work right away because it took so many years for us to get pregnant. And they saw that I had okay progesterone levels, not great. So they just went ahead and right away put me on a progesterone supplement to make sure I was making enough progesterone so that implantation would be encouraged and would stick. All right, so the embryo, as that blastocyst is implanted, now it's growing into an embryo and it's secreting this HCG, which I showed you. You can see where it's really peaking. And that prompts that corpus luteum. If you remember, I don't think it's in this picture, but okay, yeah, you can kind of see it here. Once the secondary oocyte gets ovulated, remember the corpus luteum forms, and it'll degenerate if implantation doesn't occur. But if it does occur, that corpus luteum just keeps secreting progesterone and estrogens, which is going to keep encouraging this process to keep going and differentiation to keep happening. And again, HCG is the hormone that the pregnancy tests detect. Now, I mentioned the placenta earlier. This is the temporary organ. It's made from embryonic and maternal tissues, and it's formed during the 2nd month of pregnancy, and it's going to take over as the nutritive, respiratory, excretory, and endocrine organ by the end of the 3rd month. So a lot of women struggle with morning sickness, exhaustion. Those are some of the symptoms of the first trimester, which is the first 3 months. And it's because their bodies are producing all the things. But when this placenta takes over, it really takes the burden off of the mother for a time being at least, and really takes over a lot of these functions. And specifically because it takes over hormone production, that HCG starts to decline around 3 months because it doesn't need to keep motivating anything to keep secreting, because the placenta is going to be running all of that. The HCG also has another secondary function, which is really important. It helps to prevent the mom's immune system from rejecting the implanted embryo, because some immune systems will recognize it as foreign, and we want it to stay if we want a healthy pregnancy. And so once that placenta takes over all of these roles, the corpus luteum will degenerate, and then your ovaries basically just go inactive for the rest of pregnancy until your cycle starts up again, which for some can be a month after delivery. For some, it could be a year after they've delivered a baby. So it just kind of depends. And this placenta kind of grows with the baby throughout the 9 months, and it will be birthed also. So that's something that a lot of people don't know about. We talk about delivery at the end of the notes. All right, so that development. What's going on? So that blastocyst, we eventually start to refer to it as a gastrula. And that's when it's becoming an embryo with 3 germ layers, as you can see in this picture. So the outer part is ectoderm, which is also known as the outer skin, and it is going to differentiate and develop into nervous system and epidermis. The mesoderm is the middle part. It's basically going to become everything else that the ecto and endo don't. And then the endoderm is going to become the epithelial linings of your digestive, your respiratory, and your urogenital system. So gastrulation is that first part of getting those 3 germ layers, and then organogenesis starts to happen after that. So that's the process of body organ and organ system formation. So gastrulation is kind of the first part of like differentiating those identical cells that resulted from mitosis into unique cells. And then those cells organize into different tissue groups, and then organogenesis kind of kicks in, which starts differentiating into the different organs and organ systems. And it all happens so quickly, which we're going to see. So during the embryonic period, a couple other key things that happen. The amniotic sac forms, which is just a fluid-filled sac, and it's going to contain and protect the embryo that's inside the placenta. And then the umbilical cord forms, which is what connects the embryo to the placenta for all of that exchange of nutrients and waste. And by the end of week 8, that's when we were transitioning from the embryonic period to the fetal period, and we can now refer to the embryo as a fetus. And this is what's so crazy. At this time, all of the adult organ systems are recognizable because of organogenesis, even though the fetus now, or the embryo now being called a fetus, is still so gummy bear like. This is what it would almost look like. Normally, doctors will take you in for the first time to have an ultrasound around 8 weeks. This is actually my ultrasound when I went in 8 weeks. I was actually only measuring 7 weeks and 3 days, but this is what shows up. It looked like nothing. If there was a microphone that, first you could see the flickering of the heart, which was crazy, and then you could hear the heartbeat through the computer. If I hadn't heard that or seen that, I would have been like, what is that? Like, I see nothing. But this is actually just a really rudimentary image of this. And all of these organ systems are basically developed, which is very crazy and cool. And then obviously the rest of the pregnancy, they're going to get much more advanced. So that's what we're just going to kind of hit the highlights on now, just because you're going to cover this in more detail in your pregnancy project. But essentially now, because we just ended kind of right here between month 2 and 3, the rest of these months, all of your body systems are just going to keep developing. I'm just going to highlight some of the main things that are going down in each month. But again, everything is developing in some facet each month long. So again, month 2, all your the baby's major brain regions are present. Its limbs are present. Its bones start to ossify. And the cardiovascular CV system is fully functional at this point. Like the heart's been pumping blood since week 4, but now it's like coming up really clearly on an ultrasound, and it's just fully circulating blood for the embryo at that point. Month 3, this is when blood cell formation starts going down in the bone marrow. Lungs begin developing at this point, and they're one of the things that take the longest time to develop. And the baby can do cool things like open and close its fists, which is pretty cool to see on an ultrasound if you end up having one around that 12-week time period. So then after that, you're considered to be in the second trimester. Month 4, some of the highlights. Baby can blink and suck its thumb and yawn. This is when reproductive organs are fully developed, although they can be still a little bit hard to detect on an ultrasound, which is why most doctors have you wait till month 5 until you're about closer to 20 weeks if you're trying to see the gender and you want to know it early. Bones start to become more distinct, and then glands start developing in the gastrointestinal tract. Month 5 is when hair starts to grow and limbs start to reach their final proportions. And this is when most mothers can start to feel the baby move. This is when most will go in also and get an anatomy scan where they'll measure all these different parts of the baby's body and the baby's proportions, the chambers of the heart, and different dimensions of the brain, just to make sure everything is growing correctly. This was pretty cool that when we had our anatomy scan here, this is when we could literally, I couldn't feel the baby yet, but the baby was literally doing somersaults inside, and then we could see the baby clenching the fist and doing all that, which was pretty cool. Months 6 and 7, main things going down is just weight gain. The baby starts to really put on some weight, and thus so does the mom. The spinal cord myelonates, so that's really important. And then hearing starts to fully develop. This is where people, may start really singing or talking to their baby. Some people will even put headphones on their stomach to try to get the baby to listen to music, that kind of thing. And then months 8 and 9, we're just putting on the fat. The baby is just getting yummy and chunky, and the skin's thickening, and there's a lot of brain and lung development that happen these last 2 months. That's usually one of the biggest issues with babies that are born early, is the lung development. And that's one of the things that they'll do, spend a lot of time in the NICU, is just staying there and making sure those lungs get to where they need to be, so there isn't any long-term respiratory issues. All right, so what's going on in the mom during this time period? Main factors related to anatomical changes in the mom. One is just breast swelling. That can start super early. I mean, for some, that's one of the very first signs in the first trimester, and it'll continue, especially as the breasts start to make colostrum and start to prepare for lactation towards the end of the pregnancy. The uterus also just really expands. The uterus normally is about fist size. If you close your hand, that's a fist. But it'll get big enough that it's taking up the entire abdominal cavity. Like right now, I'm having a hard time breathing because the baby is taking up all the way from my diaphragm all the way to my bladder. So pressure is on my bladder, making me have to urinate, and pressures on my lungs, making me out of breath. And the way this happens is your placenta secretes a hormone called relaxin that just lets everything basically relax and stretch out. So that's how that's possible. This causes a lot of secondary issues for some people, like heartburn, just because it's putting that pressure on that gastrointestinal tract, which will cause some of that those gastric juices just to kind of make their way into the esophagus. And then constipation too, as there's pressure on the rectum and the intestines. It can just make processing food challenging. Also, your kidneys are just processing so much more waste, which leads to a lot more urination. And then this is what's, I think, is the most crazy, is that blood volume increases by 40% by the 32nd week of pregnancy. And so that's just so much more work on the mother's cardiovascular system as well. So just a lot of things going on there. All right, so what happens when it's time for labor and delivery? Well, childbirth is probably one of the clearest examples and best examples of a positive feedback loop, where hormones are being secreted and they're encouraging the secretion of even more hormones to just keep going and going and going until the baby is born. So a couple key hormones. So progesterone actually starts to decrease right here at the very end, and that causes the uterine muscles to start contracting. And then the fetus also releases cortisol, which causes the placenta to release more estrogen. The fetus also secretes oxytocin, and that causes the placenta to release prostaglandins. And these two hormones are basically working together to really stimulate more uterine muscle contractions. If it looks like your body is not going to labor on its own and you need to be induced, one of the things they'll do to induce is they'll often give you a synthetic oxytocin to try to stimulate those uterine contractions. There are major changes that have to happen to the cervix in order for the baby to be delivered. The cervix has to dilate to 10 centimeters. Okay, so this would be like 1 centimeter, just as to scale. Obviously, this isn't 1 centimeter, but to each other they are to scale. 1 centimeter, it's got to get all the way to 10 centimeters. dilated, wide, and then it has to efface or thin out 100%. So the weeks leading up to delivering a baby, you're going in and you're getting cervical checks, and they're telling you, okay, you're 1 centimeter dilated and 20% effaced or something like that. It's kind of a sign of where things are going. Contractions will start too, and that it pushes the infant's head against the cervix, because hopefully the infant will be head down. That's the position the infant comes out of the vagina in, and as it pushes against the cervix, that'll help it thin and dilate even more. So, labor and delivery, there are 3 stages. The first stage is from whenever labor starts to when you get all the way to 10 centimeters dilated. So we can kind of subdivide this stage into early labor, which is up until when you're about 3 centimeters dilated. Active labor is where you're from 3 centimeters to 7 centimeters. That's when the time period when you're going to make your way to the hospital. And then transition can happen pretty quickly. It can be 30 minutes process of going from 7 centimeters all the way to 10. And when you're at 10, you're ready to push. So the second stage is 10 centimeters dilated to the actual delivery of the baby. This is also known as the expulsion stage or the pushing stage. Some women push once or twice and the baby is out. Some women push for 3 hours and then need to have the baby vacuum assisted out. It depends on the doctor, and obviously your blood pressure, your heart rate, the baby's, all these things they're monitoring through the whole process. But usually if you're getting towards 3 hours of this second stage of pushing, the doctor may start suggesting that it may be time to consider a cesarean section. But again, a lot of factors that go into that. And then last is the third stage. This is when after the baby has come out. So you can see the umbilical cord is still connected. They're going to clip it. After that, usually within 20 or 30 minutes, the placenta will be delivered. And this is known as the afterbirth. So that temporary organ, you don't keep it once you've made it once. It gets delivered as well. And then if you get pregnant again later in life, you'll develop another placenta. And that, my friends, is how babies are born and develop. And that is our brief overview of pregnancy.